Amina is a young adult novel set in Mogadishu, Somalia, starting in August 2011, or a little bit earlier actually. And it's a novel about a young girl who has been really lucky up until this point in her life. Although many members of her family have left Mogadishu for far-flung parts of the world, her family is intact. But at the start of the novel, her father is dragged off by Al-Shabaab soldiers because he's an artist, and nobody knows what happens to him. And then very shortly afterwards, her brother is kidnapped by Al-Shabaab soldiers and presumably forced to be a child soldier, though they don't know. So she's left alone with her mother, who's pregnant and ill, and her grandmother, who's elderly and has lots of problems with arthritis. So she has to be the public face of her family, which is a very dangerous position for her to be in as a young woman in a very conservative Muslim country, where much of the fighting has been about what type of Islam, what type of faith is going to control the country. And Amina herself is an artist, like her father. She loves to draw. She loves to write poetry, which is a very Somali thing to do. And because there have been limited supplies for her art, she's learned to create art using the rubble of the city. She makes street art, she draws graffiti, she draws her poems on the abandoned walls of buildings all over the city, and she also uses the rubble, the material of the rubble, to create other artwork. So she's a young woman that is beginning to lose everything at the beginning of the story. So I have a lot of connections to Africa. The first connection that I was aware of came the summer that I turned 19. I applied to work with gang youth in Paterson, New Jersey for the summer, and the organization said, "We would love to have you come work for us this summer, but we think that we would like to send you to Nairobi, Kenya to work with street kids there instead." And my life was transformed that summer. I remember there were moments that summer thinking that I wanted nothing more than to go home and live a life of comfort and ease the rest of my life. But by the end of the summer, I realized that I needed very little to be happy. I wanted to be warm at night, and I wanted enough food. I didn't want to go hungry. But other than that, I wanted to, be able to be clean, because there were weeks at a time when we had no water. When I planned to go there that summer, my mother told me, or reminded me rather, that my parents had gone to northern Kenya 20 years earlier when my father was doing his dissertation research in the Rift Valley. And when they returned, my mother was about 3 months pregnant with me. Many years after that, when I was in graduate school and I needed to take a summer course, I signed up for an African history course and realized how little I knew about the continent, even after having spent a summer there. And I ended up going on to earn 2 master's degrees in African history, one from the State University of New York at Albany and one from Stanford University. At Stanford, I also took 3 years of intensive Zulu, including an intensive Zulu course in South Africa through the Fulbright program for studying foreign languages. So I've returned many times. I have a young adult novel set in post-apartheid South Africa about a young urban Zulu girl growing up in a township, an urban township at the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And I returned to South Africa many, many times. Now, I've never been to Somalia. It's a very dangerous country to be in. I love East Africa. I love Southern Africa. These are places that I continually return to, and I certainly worked with Somali refugees in Kenya that summer that I turned 19. They were already coming down into Nairobi at that point, as the war was, really kind of just beginning there at that time. To write Amina, I had to do a tremendous amount of research. The first thing that I did was begin to read books of history about Somalia. particularly more recent books, and also novels written by Somalis. And then I started trying to make contact with Somali communities here in the United States. There are about 50 to 60,000 Somalis living in Minnesota, and another 20,000 living in San Diego, California, which is not far from me. And I'm not sure the number, but there's a sizable Somali community in Seattle, Washington as well. And then I also started reading newspaper accounts. I started looking at blogs written by Somalis, both Somalis in the United States, but Somalis elsewhere. Every news article that I could find online about Somalia, especially recent ones, every blog, every message board, and then I drove down to San Diego, where the Somali community welcomed me in, gave me food, answered my questions, let me interview them, took me around to meet other Somalis, other Somali women, and I was asking like basic questions like, how do you cook in Somalia, in Mogadishu? What do you use to cook? And then I made a trip up to Seattle as well, where many Somalis met with me and answered, all these basic, fundamental, nitty-gritty questions, but also larger questions like, what is the conflict in Somalia really about? What is it over? We have our outside perceptions, but what is your perception? What was your experience? And so then there were the nitty-gritty questions like, how do you get from one neighborhood to another when there's soldiers, or but then there were those larger questions of, how do Somalis feel about, this fundamentalist strain of Islam coming from Saudi Arabia, and trying to take over the society? Are people in league with it? Do they like the ideas? Do they rebel against them? How do people feel about these things? Another important form of research for me, which had very little to do actually with Somalia and Somali culture, but had to do with my understanding of Islam and my understanding of what it meant to be a woman in Islam, and what it meant to wear, a headscarf, and little things that I just needed to know about. Like if you put a headscarf on, do you need to wear pins to keep it on? Like, how does that work? And these were the sorts of questions that both Somali women, but also Muslim women in general, answered for me. Once I had written the book, I had a couple Muslim friends read it, and a couple Somalis read it to give me feedback and make sure that things were accurate. And I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for all the people that answered my questions, for the people that read the book and made comments and improved and corrected things that needed to be corrected. And my hope is that I've provided an accurate, authentic version with minimal mistakes. For me, the two fundamental things that I would love to have readers take away is this idea of what it's like to be a young woman growing up in a society that's torn apart by conflicting ideals in religion that affect her in particular because she's a young woman. And secondly, the idea that art offers hope and voice, and a voice that's in opposition to the status quo, whatever the status quo may be.